and welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival. I'm Andrew Castle. Our guest is a man whom I can best describe as a God-doubting Christian, though I'm sure he'll correct me if I've got that wrong. He's the former Bishop of Edinburgh of the Scottish Episcopal Church, whose latest book confirms for many his reputation as one of Scotland's foremost independent thinkers and philosophers. His book is called The Stories We Tell Ourselves, and he is, of course, Richard Holloway. Richard, good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Andrew.
And I think what I'd like to do, first of all, the stories we tell ourselves, let's be clear about the stories we're talking about. We're talking about the stories that try to make sense of life, the big stories, if you like.
Yeah, because we human beings are a bit of a puzzle to ourselves. Unlike the other animals we share the planet with, we don't seem to live naturally and thoughtlessly. We are an object of interest to ourselves. These big brains of ours have prompted questions of where did the universe come from? Did it have a meaner, a creator, a purpose? What is the nature of our humanity? Does it have a meaning and a purpose? And the dilemma, of course, is that all this transactional thinking goes on through our own minds, and we can never be sure that our own minds are telling us the truth, because we know that we can get things so badly wrong, even things that are prosaic and mundane. So there's always this edge of uncertainty and doubt. Have we really got the universe? Have we really got ourselves right? And it's a question of how you live with that uncertainty. I think you should champion it, and it should make you a little less certain about your convictions and opinion. Stand up for them, but don't kill for them. And unfortunately, we're so insecure that we often kill for wrong ideas.
But it's not a natural condition, is it, to live with uncertainty? And these stories that you quote go to the heart of it.
I think it is a natural condition, but we don't like it. We dislike a lot of our natural conditioning. We dislike our physical limitations. I mean, look at all the money that's spent on cosmetic surgery and hair transplants. Bald men don't like being bald. We operate in many ways to try and change the reality. And what I guess I'm trying to argue in this book is let's accept reality and live humbly and experimentally with it, but not be so insecure and desperate for certainty that we challenge cruelly people that we disagree with. And there's so much of that going on in the world. It's so divided at the moment. I mean, it's perilously divided. I mean, I lived through World War II. I can remember what these certainties did. They provoked one of the worst wars in human history within my lifetime. So certainty is a killer. Uncertainty can have a gracefulness to it. And you can, in a sense, you can try to be convinced about something until you discover it's not working. That's the way science operates. You operate on a hypothesis, you learn something from the failure that it doesn't stand up. You've gained something when you know you're wrong.
But the problem often that you seem to point to is not so much the story in itself, but the interpretation placed upon it. And that interpretation is placed upon it to create, as you say, certainty.
I think it's also because people don't know how to read any longer. Let me give you an example. Animal Farm by George Orwell. That's what I would call a true fiction. Now, if he'd started a religion, some people would have insisted that it wasn't just a myth, a way of talking about political reality. It actually happened. There actually was that farm, and there was a pig called Napoleon who ended up running it. And you've lost the purpose of the story. You've lost the meaning of the story. The story is a true fiction. It's a way, it didn't happen, but it happens all the time. That's one definition of myth. And one of the problems with religion, it's filled with these wonderful myths, these wonderful stories that never happened and yet happened all the time. And some people can't live with that subtlety, and they insist that, in fact, it did happen. Adam and Eve existed. Adam and Eve still exist. The story of the temptation in the Garden of Eden happens in Morningside. It happens in Helensburgh tonight. It didn't happen historically. It happens all the time. And so learning to read these old stories is a wonderful liberation. but there's something about a certain kind of religious mind that wants them to be treated as though they were historical events. And the tragedy with that is you lose the power of the original story because you've tried to turn it into history. And that, I think, is one of the great tragedies of fundamentalist religion.
I want to come back to Adam and Eve a little later, but you start off actually comparing two of the big stories which go to the heart of our creation, if you like. One is Genesis in the Bible. The other, of course, is the Big Bang Theory, which is science, which is also guilty, isn't it, of doing the same thing as religion?
Well, I suppose it depends. You can fundamentalize science as much as you can with religion. We used to think that the world was created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. Actually, one 18th century bishop reckoned it was probably about the middle of October, so it was just about this time. We now know that that was a myth. It was a poetic way of trying to express the mystery that the universe, in fact, does exist. Science has told us another set of stories, that it probably is about 14 billion years old, that it came out of a tiny little pop, a tiny little bang that's called the Big Bang that expanded the universe. That's an extraordinary story itself, but it leads you to ask us another story. Well, how did the Big Bang happen? Was there someone that pressed a button? And so we wrestle with this. How can something come out of nothing? Every effect must have a cause. And so you say, okay, the universe is an effect that had a cause. We'll call that cause God. And the wee girl at the back of the Sunday school puts her hand up and says, but who made God? And you get flustered and you say, well, God made himself. God is self-existent. You haven't actually answered the question. You've simply found a way of not answering it, because a self-existent being is quite a hard thing to get your head around. So I'm illustrating here the way these stories just go on tying themselves in knots of spaghetti. It's exciting, but there's no absoluteness in any of it.
But, I mean, looking at the science side of it, the Big Bang, for example, we talk about Genesis and how it should be read, but you look at the Big Bang Theory, and before that there was a different scientific theory, wasn't it? The steady state theory, that we were somehow always there, the universe just existed. So they changed the facts and changed the story to suit and to come up with a certainty of their own.
I guess it was because scientists themselves disagree. I remember, I think it was in the 50s, there was this debate between the steady state theory and the Big Bang theory, that it had always existed. I think Hoyle was one of the scientists that proclaimed that. That went out of fashion. That there was a jump in paradigm. There was a very important book written called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which showed that science was just as interruptive and conflicted as theology. But what happens, there's a big tussle between scientific ideas, and one idea wins out, and the Big Bang Theory won. What it seems to imply, there was a time when there was nothing, and then something popped into existence. I find that theological rather than scientific, because there's almost a kind of mysticism about it. I can't quite get my head around. And the kind of brains we have wanting to know reasons, you would say, okay, so what caused the Big Bang? And nowadays they say nothing caused it. It's a bit like saying, what's north of the North Pole? You can't ask a question like that, apparently. I find this almost as mystical theology. But it's an example of what we humans can't help doing. We're cursed, blessed with these big minds of ours, and we wrestle with this kind of stuff. And if we get tired wrestling, we stop wrestling and we create an absolute explanation, either scientific or theological. But they don't last for very long. They constantly get overturned. And that's what makes human exciting, but a bit boring sometimes.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because scientists, I mean, if religion has form on this, as we've discussed, science certainly has form on this. I remember this as a young lad learning physics, and much like the girl questioning God, well, who made God? I was in this physics lesson, and the teacher was explaining to me why this happened, because light was a waveform. And then I finally groped my way to a question. So, yeah, but how does that explain that? He said, because it's also a particle. It's a photon. And that just completely, I thought, well, if you're just going to make up alternative explanations for this, what is the point of setting an exam which deals in a certainty I can't get my head around?
Yeah, they're all approximations. And one of the exciting things, I don't understand, I don't have a scientific brain. I've got a kind of poetic, artistic brain. I wrestle with this stuff. You're obviously scientifically educated. I'm not. But the thing that intrigues me, at the particle level, the subatomic level, it almost becomes poetry and mysticism, that a thing can be there and not there at the same time, that a thing can be uncaused and just pop into existence. So it may be that the great mystics and the great scientists are closer than we realized. All is mystery. The question is, how do you choose to live in the midst of all this uncertainty? Does it make you a hard fanatic who needs certainty and crushes political and scientific disagreement? Or does it give you an ability to flex, to do a kind of an ontological jazz, to live with uncertainty, to listen to others and to respond? I find that much more graceful and more exciting than to live with rigid certainties.
And what interesting to me then, if the point of these stories, whether it's religious, scientific, or perhaps even political, is to create certainty, the key there is then interpreting these stories. How should we do that? Is there a way, for example, of looking at the story of Genesis, or indeed of Adam and Eve, and interpreting that in a way which allows us to be uncertain?
I think, well, forget uncertainty for a moment. Just let's think of the Adam and Eve story. I already said that it's a myth. A myth is not anything that happened once. It's something that happens all the time. If you learn how to read stories differently, to identify poetry and allegory and parable, you can see that the story of Adam and Eve is a story of discontent. Doesn't that mirror our existence? We are creatures prone to discontent. We want to change our hairstyle. We want to change our life partners. There's something about the human creature that isn't utterly and permanently at home in the universe. And the story of Adam, Eve, and the Garden of Eden reflects that. It's a story about human discontent and the traps it can lead us into, because there is no perfect existence. And so it's a wonderful story to meditate on, but if you insist that it's not a fairy story that's true all the time, but actually happened, that if you were there with a video camera, you would have seen Adam and Eve hiding themselves because they were naked, and God came into the garden and said, "Who told you that you were naked?" You lose the power and passion of the story. So one of the things I'm actually asking for in the book is the ability to read the different genres of stories that there are, and not to trap yourself in a fundamentalist version of any of them. Learn to flex, to do this kind of jazz of existence. You listen, I've changed my mind about all this stuff many times. It's been uncomfortable, but I'd rather have done that than be an utterly fixed robotic machine buying one particular interpretation of life, especially if it makes me a hater of those whose story differs from mine. And I've already said that one of the terrifying things about living in this century is the way big fascistic stories are coming back, big fascistic political stories are coming back, and literally endangering the human species. And it's all because you don't know how to read this stuff. There is no absolute certainty in any of this.
And I'll come on to the authoritarian stuff in a second, because I'm interested in that. But what struck me about this was you talk about interpreting these stories. What was the source of a lot of these, certainly Old Testament stories anyway? Were they always religious tracts, as it were, to be interpreted in that kind of certain way?
I think the answer is we can't be absolutely certain. But one of the things that we know about human beings is that we make up stories. I think it was art. I think it's this capacity for trying to figure out things, and you express them in parables and myths and in stories. So I think the original writers behind these great foundation stories were artists. And I think one of the most useful and creative ways to read religion is to see religions as art forms. They don't like that. At least certain kinds of religious figures don't like that. They want them to be sciences. They want them to be filled with absolutely hard-packed, punchy certainty. And I think that you then lose the beauty and the usefulness of them. Because if you insist on saying to me that the world was created not in 14 billion years, but in 6 days, I've lost the beauty of the story. Because I know it wasn't created in 6 days. I know that was a poet, that was an artist trying to figure out, where does all this come from? And you can see them sitting round the table, round the campfire, figuring it all out, the way poets do, the way fiction writers read the human experience into these narratives that are packed with meaning and passion for us.
And then they were, somehow co-opted by Christianity and the Bible and turned into actual events?
I think, it's a good question, that, and I can't absolutely historically argue it. But what seems to happen is that we get these great kind of religious artists who imagine these stories, who tell these myths, who conjure them out of their own imagination. And they're out there, the stories are out there. And then along comes a different breed. We call them clergy, people who come along and who organize these stories into systems. And there are always the systematizers, the people who lack imagination, but who like to police the stories that imaginative people have created. And so you get a religion formed. And a religion that starts as a creative art ends up being almost a kind of police system. It's a power system. And they insist not that this was creative artistic thinking, but that it was fundamental divine revelation. And that it was historical. Nietzsche was the great prophet of this. Nietzsche said, the way religions die is when they cease to understand they are creative myths, but insist that they become science. And that's why a lot of people have given up religion, because while they like a lot of the poetry and the beauty and the music of religion, they can't stand it when the guys in the long black frocks insist that it actually happened like that. That it's not just poetry and music and art, it's scientific historical fact. And it wasn't. And so you lose the wonderful stories. That's the tragedy of the history of religion.
And the other arm, of course, is that, if you don't somehow believe this, then you are eternally damned.
That's the next trick, because they want to sell this. They become, in a sense, businesses. I mean, great religions are... They're kind of ideological commerce. They want you to buy their ideas. I mean, literally, some people still go around the door selling magazines. You may have had a couple at your door selling the Watchtower. It's almost as they want you to buy into this commerce of ideas that they call a religion. And so a religion becomes a way of selling a particular package of ideas. I'm an instinctively religious person. The thing that breaks my heart about that is you lose the poetry of religion, because most people know that it's not science, that those things didn't happen like that once. But if you can say to them, but if you learn to poetize and understand this stuff artistically, it will still speak to you. It will tell you about your own discontents, your own disagreements, and maybe help you to discipline them and live with them, and not to hope that there is some magic place for you over the rainbow where life is perfect. I mean, the Judy Garland myth shows us that there is no life over the rainbow. It's always muddled and complex and beautiful and sad and tragic. Learn to live with it gracefully and lovingly. If you can achieve that in life, that's a lot.
And this insistence, certainly on the part of religion, but it's by no means exclusive, I suspect, to religions and the church in particular, this insistence that you must believe the story as certainty creates and has created, in your view, such suffering down the centuries.
Oh, absolutely. And not just in religion. I mean, the great kind of secular religious myths of the 20th century, fascism, totalitarian Marxism, just think of the misery, the millions that have been destroyed by them, trying to impose these great political religions on whole populations. We saw it in the collectivization experiment under Stalin. We're seeing a lot of it in China at the moment. Roger Scruton, the philosopher, called these political myths ruthless optimisms. This idea that you've finally discovered the right way to live, and it gives you the right to exterminate the opposition. And that's what these great kind of political messianic figures have done in my lifetime. And what I'm pleading for, and what lots of other philosophers have pled for, is don't be sure about any of this, because there is no absolute certainty in politics or in religion or in art. Everything is a kind of dance that's going on. Learn to change partners, learn to switch, but do not allow your thinking to make you cruel, to make you an exterminator. And so often religious and political myths do that, because we know we're not certain about any of this. We can't live with our uncertainties. And so we punish in others what we can't face in ourselves. It's a bit like hating gay people. We know the twists that the human psyche is capable of. And Adam Phillips, the great psychoanalyst, says that you can almost tell the presence of inner doubt in a person by the passionate way in which they claim they have no doubt. They're the real doubters, the dangerous doubters, because they kill because they can't face their doubt.
What's interesting about that is how then do we explain the notion of, as it were, fake news and conspiracies when it comes to authoritarian figures? They're using kind of uncertainty to create a new certainty in them.
Yeah, and it's a perfect illustration of what we're talking about, Andrew. This inability to flex, to think maybe we're not quite right, there isn't one absolute way of seeing the universe, that it is intrinsically messy, both in the understanding of its science, in the way that we should live alongside each other, in our attitudes to race and to sexuality, that none of this is absolutely certain, that we're all making it up as we go along, we're all trying to figure it out, and we hate all that. And one of the most devastating things about life at the moment in our century is the way that people are imagining these vast conspiracy theories. But they've always existed. I mean, there's nothing particularly new about this. There have always been these conspiracy theories that the reason why things are unhappy, why my life is not perfect, is that there's some gang out there organizing the world in a way that's impacting me and making me suffer. No, that is intrinsic to the human condition. Nothing is certain, only the certain spring, only the glory of nature. Anything intellectual and metaphysical is up for grabs and needs to be discussed. Argue passionately, but do not allow it to make you a punisher, a dictator, because history shows that's what we're tempted to do. I mean, isn't it awful what the passion for certainty has done to us politically in my lifetime and is doing again? I mean, I don't want to point the finger across the Atlantic, but it's devastating what's going on over there. The claims that are being made on the basis of absolutely no clarity or objectivity, simply as kind of psychological plagues. We are scary creatures. It may be that the world is trying to purge itself of us, and we're so hateful and capable of cruelty. We may do ourselves away, and then I think, like nature after Chernobyl, it comes back and lives in balance without us. We are the unbalanced part of creation.
But aren't the politicians, and you refer to, I assume, President Trump and what's going on across in America, aren't they merely aping, if you like, imitating what priests and religious figures have done down through the centuries? They're creating an uncertainty, exploiting the need for certainty to create uncertainty, to bring them back to in line, as it were.
Absolutely. I mean, and the same is happening in the big debates in our country. I mean, the way Brexit was theologized. I mean, I don't want to take sides in any of this, because I think one of the things that we have to learn to do is to read other people's stories, to learn how they interpret. That's how you see it. This is how I see it. And to get away from saying, this is how I see it, and it's the only way to see it. The very fact that we're having this discussion about the world of differences there are understanding politics at the moment should show us that all of this stuff is transactional. None of it is absolutely clearly fixed and demonstrably true, and therefore we should learn to live with a certain kind of glorious flexibility. And isn't it, I mean, it's a liberating way to live. It means that I might learn something from you if I can listen rather than pronounce. And religions are great at pronouncing. They tell us, unless you hold this idea in your head, you are damned, literally damned in the case of certain theological ideas. And think of the monstrousness of that. Unless you can believe a certain formula in your head, you're going to be damned for eternity. You're going to be punished in hellfire. What a monstrous kind of notion that is. It shows what clearly insecure creatures we are, that we can come up with something as awful as that in the name supposedly of a God.
And it's all based, I mean, going back to the Adam and Eve story for a moment, I mean, it's that notion that, you know, that woman was somehow responsible for the original sin, and that again, that's led to this kind of suffering down the ages and blaming people, all in the name of creating, well, this is certainty. It was their fault. This is why we are how we are, and this is what we must do about it. This is what shapes our view of sex and original sin.
And that's deep in Christianity, that hatred of women. The woman gave me, and I did eat, Adam said. I mean, it's the original blaming of the woman for everything. And a lot of kind of theologians in the 4th and 5th centuries who were obsessed with managing their own sexuality blamed women for this. And the entail of that is still very strong in our history. This notion that you blame women for your own desire. The whole, one of the things we're trying to do in our culture is to reverse all that. The whole Me Too movement is trying to get men to understand their sexuality, their objectifying of women. And you and I know this, we've all done it. It's something almost instinctive with us. And a lot of it can become from misreading an old myth. The great St. Augustine of Hippo, one of Christianity's great, a beautiful theologian, but sex obsessed, and he blamed women for tempting men. He said that the perfect man never had sex, hence the preoccupation with celibacy, the impossibility of that. Reading stories the wrong way, misreading old stories can trap you in these horrible, horrible furrows of hatred and cruelty. All I'm saying in this little book, we make up these stories to explain ourselves. Learn to read them. Learn to flex your understanding of them. Otherwise, if you fundamentalize them politically and theologically, it'll make you cruel. And cruelty is the greatest sin.
But if, we find no certainty in the stories we tell ourselves, does that mean we have to put up with suffering along the way? We don't need to explain it. What do we do if we can't live without certainty, if you like?
Well, you're just going to have to, because nothing is certain in that. I mean, uninteresting things are certain. The 2-time table is certain. You can do it in your fingers. You can't be certain that there is an actual creator who created the universe. You can't be certain that there is one single political way of running a country. You can't be certain that there is a moral answer to the problem of suffering. It's one of the things that most sensitive people worry about. Is there any ultimate bringing of some meaning out of that? I mean, the great Russian novelist Dostoevsky wrestled with this notion of the suffering of children. Can any meaning be put upon that? I would like to think there might be, but if the universe is just a kind of a great accidental something that happened, the onus comes on us to live in a way that somehow balances that. And one of the things that I'm arguing in the book is there's no answer to the problem of suffering, but there can be a response to heal it.
So
to look after to suffer.
So living then, we have to learn to live with uncertainty. So what does that mean for Christians, for Muslims? What does that actually mean in practice, living with that uncertainty? What story do they tell themselves? Do we tell ourselves?
Well, they don't like that, of course. I mean, because the guys, and they're usually guys in charge of religion, they know that you can't sell something at the door if there's any uncertainty about it. If you're selling a vacuum cleaner, it has to be the best vacuum cleaner ever invented, the best religion ever invented. It answers every problem. And we know there is no such thing. But if you actually market your religion, this will make you more compassionate. It will teach you to love. I end the book with a plea for love. I quote W.H. Auden, let the more loving one be me. If our response to the uncertainty and weirdness of the universe is not to expect an absolutely perfected intellectual explanation of it, but if it prods us to live more kindly, more lovingly, if our response to the mystery of the universe is to try to care for those who are damaged by it, both animals and human beings, won't that have been worth it? And won't that be an enormous mystery, that this great meaningless thrust of energy that is the universe has created creatures who want to love it and to love one another? Even if there's no explanation for that, it's a wonderful thing to have achieved, isn't it? If it prompts us to compassion, why worry about what the intellectual roots of that are?
And I wonder if the roots of your difficulty with the church that you've experienced come from that. It's the suffering that all this demand for certainty has caused.
Absolutely. I mean, I lived through, in my own wee church, I lived through a big debate about whether women could be ministers. For God's sake. Only 5 minutes ago did we start ordaining women as priests and bishops. And the same is true of me. Most of the stuff that's going on, a lot of the world's religion, involves the official repression of women. And it doesn't all go back to the Adam and Eve story, but a lot of it goes back to male patriarchal dominance. I lived with the liberalization of homosexuality. I mean, when I was a wee boy, it was against the law. A lot of people ended up in jail. We know the blackmail stories. So one of the things that our history teaches us is that we get things wrong. And it's our inability to live with variety and plurality and the uncertainty that suggests there is no one way to be, no one way to be sexual, no one way to be a man or to be a woman. And it makes us punishers. And the thing that put me off religion for a long time was the official cruelty that it espoused because of this wrong-headed need for certainty. And I was liberated by the fact that learning to flex and to do this kind of metaphysical jazz is a much more gracious way to live, because it means I can hear your experience of being human, what it's meant for you, how you see it, how it's made you live, rather than think there's only one way of being. I've come back to an understanding of religion as a possible way of being kind and promoting kindness. And my God, if that's all religion did, if it didn't say we're not sure about God, we're not sure about the nature of Jesus Christ, we are sure, be kinder, my dear. My God, we could change the world, couldn't we?
But how does a Christian live as you do without the belief in a God?
Because I know that all reality is mediated through my mind, and I know how my mind has trapped me in things that weren't true. A bit of me wants to believe in God. A bit of me suspects what believing in God might do to me, because it depends the God you're talking about. If God is in a sense a human creation, we make God in our own image. The Bible tells us God made us in his image, but in fact we know we make God in our image, which is why we made all these intensely cruel gods. Most of the gods that have existed in human history have had this ferocious capacity for cruelty. And that's what makes me worry about God as a human construct, because it inevitably reflects our humanity, and our humanity is capable of great cruelty. And if it's a divine form of cruelty, it is incessant and eternal, it's omnipotent, all of that. So be wary about the God that you believe in.
So you should live life as if God doesn't exist, even if you're a Christian or a believer, as it were.
And you brought me to one of the key texts in my book. There was a great German theologian, a German martyr called Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was part of the conspiracy early on to get rid of Hitler, and he was imprisoned and executed. And while he was in prison, he wrote some remarkable letters. Can I read you one or two of them?
Of course, yes.
He wrote some remarkable letters to his pal Eberhard Bethge about the way being in prison had prompted him to rethink everything about theology. And he quoted a medieval jurist called Grotius, who'd said that we have to do the right thing as if God did not exist. Ecce Deus non daretur is the Latin phrase. And he said, the trouble with living well because you're divinely prompted is you're not living well for its own sake. You're living well out of obedience to God. Therefore, it's not true morality. What we have to do is to do the good thing, even if there's no God. Ecce Deus non daretur. We have to do the good thing because doing the good thing is the good thing to do. And if you only do it out of obedience, I'm ranting now, but if I only act ethically because I'm ordered to, I'm not acting ethically. I'm being blackmailed into it by a superior power. And while he was in prison, Bonhoeffer meditated on all this, and he came up with the extraordinary idea that God so wanted us to act well for its own sake that he wanted us to act as if there were no God. Isn't that a marvelous insight? That if God is really love, he wants us to love for love's sake, not because it's ordered by God. We have to live good, pure, loving lives, even if there's no God, as if there's no God. Because if we only live them because there is God, we're not actually living the good life, are we? We're living the obedient life. And it's an extraordinary insight. And it liberated me from a lot of metaphysical wrestling. Why wrestle with the idea of God if you can, if the best of your understanding of God is that God wants you to be loving and compassionate, to go the other mile, to be the good Samaritan? That's what counts, not the metaphysical muscle that prompted it. And so I end my book by saying, live the loving life, even if there's no God. And if there is a loving God, that's what God wants anyway. Maybe even God wants us to live as if there were no God, because only then are we living good lives for its own sake. That's liberating, because you don't then need to explain anything. The loving act, the compassionate act, the kind act carries its own meaning within it. And my God, doesn't the world need that at the moment? Live good lives, even if there's no God. And if there is a good God, that God will applaud it.
And you've got that in, I think you've got a bit of text there you were going to read. Is that right, from the book on that? You've just given us it.
Probably, I've given you, I've praised it for you.
You've praised, well, that's fine.
Do you want me to read a wee bit?
If you wish, yes.
Yeah. This is one of the letters that Bonhoeffer wrote. God as a working hypothesis in morals, politics, or science has been surmounted and abolished, and the same thing has happened in philosophy and religion. For the sake of intellectual honesty, that working hypothesis should be dropped or, as far as possible, eliminated. And we cannot be honest unless we recognize that we have to live in the world ecce Deus non daretur. And this is just what we do recognize before God. God himself compels us to recognize it. So our coming of age leads us to a true recognition of our situation before God. God would have us know that we must live as men who manage our lives without him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. The God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis of God is the God before whom we stand continually. Before God and with God, we live without God. You see what that means? It means if God is love and wants us to love one another as we are loved by God, it's the love that counts. And even if we live love without God, we are living God.
But isn't living without God as if God wasn't there? Isn't that just a version of living as with common humanity, the kind of values that we all espouse to?
Sure, yeah. But do we all espouse to them? There seems to be a lot of non-espousal of living with that kind of humanity. And it brings us all back to the certainty thing. My politics are right, yours are wrong. My religion is right, yours is wrong. What I'm asking throughout is, how do you empirically validate your politics or religion? How does it make you act? What kind of person does it make you in response to me or to someone else, to some cruelly abused child? And if you look at the state, this world is sodden in pain and sorrow. Little children in burning refugee camps, refugees being turned away from our shores, the hatred of political discourse. If that's the story, if that's the result of the story you're telling yourself, rethink it. But if the story you're telling yourself makes your heart bleed with compassion for others and even prompts you to do a single act of kindness and caring, we could transform this world that's sodden and cruelty. And that's, in a sense, all I'm asking for.
Let me put to you then a question I've received from Clive. He says that in a world that's suffering from extreme fundamentalists whose unstinting belief in what you would call, have called myths, how does the world affect the change which would bring peace?
Oh my God, that's
a big question.
I don't think it's ever affected permanently. I think that all we can do is make a little difference here. We can give a cup of cold water. We can visit someone in prison here. I don't think there are any universal, absolute ways of changing things. I think, but you can make a difference where you are, in the way you act towards your neighbor. And I think that one of the ways I think about it is that you can live this perfect kingdom in tiny acts of love and care and compassion, but you never bring it in universally. But you can ameliorate it for individuals here and there. I would be suspicious of any big claim saying if you buy this package, we'll transform humanity forever. I don't think we ever will, but we can make a difference to that person and that person, to that situation and that situation. We can ameliorate, we can never perfect.
But if living, if you live with, espousing towards common humanity, or you live that life of goodness without the need for God necessarily to be there, that depends, does it? If you're going to change things, that requires other people who are so adherent to their myths to actually receive and understand and act accordingly.
Yeah, and that's a tough one.
Yeah, there's no evidence that works, is
so there are stories we have to resist. I think we have to be loving resistors. I think that if a story prompts hatred, then we need to challenge it. One way to do that is to get out and vote the right way, to organize. I think none of this is ever going to be permanently sorted. It's just the way we live. We live with this kind of uncertainty. We live with this imperfection, including in our own lives. Look the way we struggle to perfect our own little bit of living. To get rid of bad habits and create better habits. I'm saying here that perfection is unachievable, improvement is. Slowly, incrementally, a wee loving act here, a wee kind act there. It never goes amiss. It makes a difference to some. I mean, I don't know, there's a lovely story I used to take when I preached about a man walking along a beach one day. And he thinks he sees a man dancing on the beach away. He keeps throwing his arm and he realizes, in fact, he's not dancing. A lot of starfish have been washed up on the shore and he's throwing them back in. And the man says to the starfish dancer, you won't make any difference. There are thousands of them. And the man bends down and picks up a starfish and throws it back. And he said, it makes a difference to that one. You can difference to individuals. Single acts of compassion and kindness can transform a life. You'll never get all the starfish thrown back into the ocean, but you can throw this one and that one and make a difference to them.
So What is the story you now live by then? Is it that Bonhoeffer version, or because you talk in the book about living like Jesus, as it were, and that's your ambition now, is it?
That's my story. That's the story I realize I try very imperfectly to live by. And there were two big elements in the Jesus story. One was that he wanted us to see the world from the bottom up, not the top down. We know that the world is a pyramid in which the poor and the suffering at the bottom bear the weight of the few at the top, leading these very privileged lives. See the world, try and see the world from the bottom up. But the other great thing he pointed to was the need for radical forgiveness. What forgiveness does, we all act badly, very often unknowingly. And what forgiveness does, it interrupts the power of that bad act to go on happening. And if you think of all the great political controversies and wars that are going on, a lot of them happened because there was an original falling out and it was never interrupted. It went on exploding through time. Israel, Palestine, the Northern Ireland thing, which we did learn a little bit to manage with the Good Friday Peace Agreement. Let's park the original offense and not let it flow into the way we're going to live towards each other. Let's forgive it. Forgiveness isn't a kind of indifference. It's a decision not to let the act that you did against me destroy our relationship forever. And politically, it's immensely powerful. This notion. Desmond Tutu and Mandela did it in South Africa. That could have turned into a bloodbath, a civil war of revenge. But in the Peace Commission in South Africa, they owned the sins of the white apartheid regime. They were forgiven and they moved into a very muddled South Africa, but it didn't become a bloodbath of revenge. If we learn to live by these two instincts of Jesus, there's need to see things from the people who are oppressed by political and establishment reality, and the need to forgive. Most of us learn how to forgive in our personal lives. Political forgiveness is much more difficult, but my God, if we could achieve it, the endemic wars that are happening. I mean, I've lived through hundreds of wars. I was born in 1933. The big one was the Second World War. But there hasn't been a time when we've been sending boys to be killed. If we could somehow learn to practice political forgiveness, we could make these transformative differences here and there. And that's the story I try feebly to live by, as if there were no God, but because these stories are themselves powerful and transformative.
But you talk about Jesus there, but didn't his story create a certainty, which was very quick? I mean, this certainty of the second coming, as it were, which we're still waiting for.
Yeah. I don't buy all of Jesus' ideas. He was a man of his time. He felt he was a God-prompted person. He wanted God to come and transform the world eschatologically. And we all want that. Wouldn't it be wonderful? That's a deep longing in all religion, this idea that God will suddenly erupt into history and transform it and make it equal and perfect and pure. Didn't happen. But you can live with that story by saying, okay, it's up to us then. If God, either because there is no God or because God's timetable is different, if God refuses to come in and do a miraculous transformation, it leaves it up to us to do many transformations here and there. And I can get that from the Jesus story. He told us to try and live that God's kingdom now. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven now. Let's try and live that way now. I interpret that story kind of in a secular way. I don't think that God is ever going to come. But it prompts me to try and do little mini comings, little transformative acts that will make a difference to that life and that life here, even though I can't do a big sweeping eschatological transformation.
And does that explain your, if I can put it in those terms, your rapprochement, as it were, with the church? Because I think most people assumed you'd cast your, to use another phrase, cast your ticket in, but you've had a kind of rapprochement. You're still part of the church. Given what you've said, I wonder how you square that.
I don't square it. It's uncomfortable. I mean, there is no absoluteness in any of this. But I find that wanting to live this life that sees things from the bottom up, this forgiving life, I find that listening to the Jesus story helps me do that. It helps me examine and forgive elements in my own life, my own need for forgiveness, my own need to forgive. I find that listening to that story helps me do that.
But do you think do you need the church to do that? Couldn't you just live by your own story?
I seem to need it. It helps me do it. I practice religion as poetry and art, not as science. I know lots of Christians don't practice it in that way, but it helps me to live a slightly better life than I otherwise might. I need the music of it, the poetry of it. I'm no longer in the business of trying to persuade people to live this way or that way. All I'm doing now, this is where I've stumbled towards. It's the way I'm now trying to live this story. I commend it to you. I'm not insisting that you follow it because it's full of inconsistencies. I don't mind living the inconsistent life. My God, the mistakes I've made in my life, I realize there is no permanent consistency anywhere. But just ask yourself, do these theories, religious or political, make me kinder, more loving, more helpful towards others? If they don't, think about it.
There's a question from John Armstrong. He says, what about the quiet certainty that people enjoy from conventional religion that they will have an everlasting and eternal life? Because I don't think that's something you believe in particularly, is it?
It's not a question of believing. It's not anything I want. And most of the prospectuses of life eternal don't attract me. No, I think when I die, I think that'll be it. And I hope I'll die gratefully. But I know that there have been millions of people on earth who found the thought of life after death, especially losing a loved one, helpful. If that's a story that helps you, then live with it, believe it. I'm not trying to knock that story. It's just not a story I need.
And in terms of as you say, living the Jesus life, what about the certain absolutes in daily life that will help you do that? I mean, there are certain certainties that whole society has to live by, don't they? The business of, we don't hurt children, we judge others, we don't judge others by the colour of their skin. Those sort of certainties we do need, don't we?
And we discuss. I mean, just think of the history of those things. When I was a wee boy in school, I was belted daily. I was a very turbulent wee boy. We no longer do that. We've learnt. Remember the taws, the great leather strap split down the middle? I was belted a lot. I can still remember the pain. We don't do that. It's actually now illegal. We used to jail homosexuals. We used to stone them to death. One of the things that should make us pause in our certainties is the way we, throughout history, have rethought them. We've rethought the status of women. Women didn't have the vote until 1918, for God's sake. We rethought that. So it should make us humble. It should make us interrogate our own certainties, because we may be wrong. If we were wrong about giving women the vote, if we were wrong about women actually being capable of being, and most of the great sane politicians operating the world at the moment seem to me to be female, and they wouldn't even have been allowed to vote 100 years ago. So it seems to me that what our own history should do is make us pause. I might have got that wrong. I've got so many things wrong in the past. And so don't hold to your certainties too tightly. We need certain kinds of things that we try to live by. Don't hold them too tightly, because the time may come when you're going to have to drop them because you change your mind about something. The way we change our minds about women, about sexual minorities, about people with a different color of skin. Just think of the way we justified slavery. I mean, and you can justify slavery biblically because it's there in the Bible. And the great segregationists in the southern states of America, when they were opposing the ending of slavery, they quoted the Bible. For God's sake, religion is great. It's giving us ammunition for terrible ideas. Doubt it. Be less certain that you've got things right, and you might stumble your way towards getting them better.
But there are some certainties that you have to stand by. What if we have to appreciate or we have to somehow respect another person's story, which is that torture is okay and harming children is okay? That's a certainty surely we cannot live with, and we shouldn't entertain that.
No, of course. I mean, I've already told you there are some things you have to withstand. You have to be against as well as for. You have to... a lot of my struggles with the church were because I chose to withstand a lot of these false and cruel consequences of certain kinds of religious belief. Looking back in my history, most of the clergy, the priests I knew in my early life who guided me and helped me, I could see were disturbed gay men. Some of them actually did time in prison. And I look back, and we only started to change that in the 60s, for God's sake. It only became legal to have a loving partner. What was it, 1967 that started the Wolfenden proposal? I lived through all this stuff. I've seen stories we told ourselves that hurt other people that we rethought. So yes, there are some bad stories you have to withstand, but there are some good stories that help you help the weak and the vulnerable. Find those and live by them.
So, looking at the subtitle of your book, you say, stories we tell ourselves, making meaning in a meaningless universe. We can't really make meaning, can we? We have to live with the meaninglessness of it all.
Ultimately, it may be meaningless, but isn't it extraordinary? This is what keeps me on the edge of the possibility of transcendence. Isn't it odd that this meaningless universe that may have just popped into existence out of nowhere, 15 billion years on, has created creatures with a passion for meaning and purpose, who just can't live unself-consciously? I mean, it's very weird, isn't it, that the universe, that we've popped into existence as well. And here we are, the sheep on the hills in Galloway aren't having book festival to discuss the nature of sheepness, but here we are at the Wigtown Book Festival, and you do it every year. We humans are extraordinary creatures, obsessed with the possible meaning of our own existence. That to me is extraordinary. It may be that there is meaning after all. We certainly have a passion for it, and we wrestle with it, and we find different meanings, interrogate them, find good ones, find ones that make you kind.
Well, there is one certainty we do have to live with. I'm afraid that is the ticking clock. That is all we've got time for in this particular event at the Wigtown Book Festival. Just to say thank you very much to our guest, Richard Holloway. Fascinating discussion. And a reminder to people more generally, if you've enjoyed that, if you like the idea of all the events and book festivals, then do try to support us. It's a difficult time for all of us at the moment, and we'd appreciate any help you can give us in any way, shape or form. So for the moment, all I can say is thank you very much, Richard Holloway, and let's live with our uncertainty.
Lovingly. Thank you, Andrew.